Alexandra Peck received her PhD in anthropology from Brown University. She holds a BA in anthropology from Seattle University, as well as an MA in anthropology from Brown. Her research interests include Northwest Indigenous art, cultural exchange and placemaking, and geography. She also holds an academic certificate in public humanities and cultural heritage from Brown University. In addition to working with tribal nations in the Pacific Northwest, Peck has been employed by the Rhode Island School of Design Museum and Smith College Museum of Art by identifying items of cultural patrimony for repatriation under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. She has curated museum exhibits on Inuit material culture, the 2016 Dakota Access Pipeline protests on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation, Indigenous enslavement in New England, female Native artists, and modern Northwest Coast art. Currently, she's working on digital mapping project that locates and provides context for 400 Native sites by combining oral history, archival evidence, archaeology, and contemporary Indigenous knowledge. So we're so excited to have you, Alexandra. And for those of us at the University of Minnesota, Alexandra is going to be joining us for the next 2 years as a visiting scholar of Indigenous studies. So we're hoping that this is just the beginning of our relationship with Alexandra. So Alexandra, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you to Mary, Chris, and Abby for organizing this and making sure I was in the right place at the right time, because that doesn't always happen for me. So today I have a presentation to share with you, which is a brief overview of my dissertation research, which touches on lots of issues that I'm hoping will be pertinent to maybe your studies. And that should be hopefully less than an hour. I'm aiming for 45 minutes or so. And then, like Chris said, we can open it up to discussion and comments and questions. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. I have lots of slides to show you. I'm a visual learner, so hopefully this is helpful for everyone. And give me a minute here. Okay, can you all see that? All right. Okay. Yes, as well. All right, so here we go. On Washington's Olympic Peninsula, the Jamestown S'Klallam tribe, or JST, which is just an abbreviation that I use because it's a mouthful to say. The JST is enacting contested approaches of reclaiming tribal histories that have been threatened by persistent 19th century settler colonial narratives of ethnic erasure. The tribe was legally exiled from their capital village in 1871 as a result of government mandated arson, in which Indian agents or government agents actually went through and burned down and kind of razed the village site to get people to leave, as well as various legal ordinances that banned these individuals from city limits. Ancestral JST homelands, however, also include a wide swath of land today known as Olympic National Park, in addition to small towns that kind of surround this wilderness area. This area, like I said, is popularly lauded as a kind of pristine, romanticized wilderness area devoid of native inhabitation or history. Emanating from the tribe's previously unrecognized federal status and history of intermarriage with Scandinavian loggers, tropes of assimilation and extinction contribute to the contemporary non-Indigenous public's denial of the tribe's existence. By raising totem poles, monuments that are not historically rooted within JST artistic repertoire, they are commemorating tribal leaders and events. These totem poles began to be raised by the tribe in the early 1990s. And the tribe is enacting this practice to kind of challenge their veiled history in this region that's really known today for outdoor recreation and tourism. Reclaiming territory, communicating Indigenous presence, and resisting historical amnesia via totem poles have generated reconciliation between the tribe and non-natives in the region. However, adopting totem poles as a cultural icon has also produced division within the tribe itself, with critics raising questions about the authenticity of such monuments, as well as concerns about artistic appropriation and kind of performing a pan-Indigenous identity for a tourist audience. Through a lens of resiliency and regeneration, my dissertation research analyzed the JST's opposition to being consigned to the past, as well as the challenges encountered while representing and redefining their own cultural identity. Before we go any farther, I want to acknowledge a couple of groups. First, the JST themselves, the Jamestown S'Klallam tribe, as well as tribal leadership, who encouraged my project, despite that it kind of highlighted tribal discord. They allowed me countless opportunities to share my research as it developed, which we can talk more about later, because I know one of the themes for this workshop is collaboration and kind of methodologies. With tribes collaboration, knowledge, and of course permission, the project would have not been possible. And of course, I acknowledge that I am not an expert on this topic, but I view myself as kind of merely an interpreter of tribal perspectives for a broader academic audience. So any credit should, of course, go directly to the tribe. And then secondly and lastly, before we start, this work was funded by numerous grants from Brown University, as well as the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research and the Ruth Landis Memorial Research Fund via the Reed Foundation. So here are a couple maps to kind of situate all of you, because I know we're all coming from different parts of the world today. The first map, the small map on top, obviously shows North America, and in red is Washington State, which is the state in which I do most of my research. The second map in the lower left-hand corner shows kind of very broad tribal designations along the Northwest coast, so reaching from Washington up into that Alaska area, as well as British Columbia in the center. And the Jamestown S'Klallam, the tribe that I work with, is a Coast Salish tribe, which is a very broad umbrella term that we use to refer to dozens of tribes that kind of occupy that area in that lovely 70s green color. There are dozens of these tribes. They all are distinct languages, and they have similar cultural customs. So when I say Coast Salish, I mean Jamestown S'Klallam and vice versa. And then as you go up the map, you see Haida and Tlingit and Kwakwaka'wakw communities. These are where totem poles originated to be the as well as they play into these ideas of cultural appropriation that we're going to discuss further on. And then the second map on the bottom right-hand corner is the Jamestown S'Klallam tribe's traditional territory, where they had villages, as well as where they fished and hunted and occupied the land within Washington and Western Washington. For this project, I spent 15 months of on-the-ground research at my field site, which consisted of archival research at historical societies, museums, tribal libraries. I conducted roughly 200 interviews with tribal artists, elders, youth, non-natives, educators, and community members. These were informal conversations that lasted 30 minutes to 2 hours. I also collected approximately 100 written or oral surveys from tourists and visitors who frequented the JST reservation to get their thoughts. I located, mapped, and recorded information related to the tribe's 50+ totem poles, as well as significant tribal sites. And in my dissertation, I provide a glossary about information about all these poles and places, as well as their S'Klallam names and translations. Lastly, I volunteered at tribal events as a means of furthering my observation and my participation within the tribe, as well as a way to give back to the tribal nation that graciously allowed me to kind of examine their history and modern presence for the purpose of my dissertation. I employed numerous theoretical literatures to examine this complex issue, including discussions about tourism, monument studies and public art, invented traditions, cultural memory, and placemaking. Broad frameworks also include settler colonialism and deconstructing notions of tradition or authenticity. The JST use of totem poles in a Coast Salish setting in Washington defies stagnant or monolithic definitions of indigeneity, refusing to be limited by any particular definition of what it means to be Native is a real tenet of JST culture. And this fact is kind of elucidated by the case study of JST totem poles. The tribe's history of Scandinavian intermarriage, their selective use of non-Native institutions, and their inclusion of non-Native carvers to create the poles also supports the assertion that to be JST is really to be an anomaly or anomalous. This is not to say, of course, that the tribe is lacking a coherent identity or cultural heritage, but rather all of these factors kind of comprise JST culture, with JST citizens identifying themselves as fully Sklallam because of, but not despite, their diverse history. Though the JST language still exists today, as well as songs and stories that are passed down through oral sources, the tribe is proud of their ability to create and kind of continue new traditions. And this ability really signifies, I think, that the culture is alive and changing rather than concerned solely with replication or duplication. The diversity and dynamism present within the JST community challenges ideas of Native America as composed of static or authentic individuals. Resisting these labels threatens the settler colonial mindset, which is determined to extinguish indigeneity by creating and enforcing impossible requirements for authenticity. We see this through blood quantum and federal recognition processes in the United States, as well as Canada. Settler colonialism understands that such prerequisites are nearly impossible to attain, thereby attempting to guarantee the eradication of Indigenous peoples. In short, the JST has ensured its own survival by rejecting a monolithic identity rather than abiding by these notions of authenticity. To start, I'm going to give a pretty thorough historical background because I think it's really important to contextualize some of these issues. The Olympic Peninsula comprises 3,600 square miles that surround the Pacific Ocean, the Strait of Juan de Fuca to the north. Once you cross that strait, you're in Canada. It's about 60 miles, I believe, as well as Puget Sound to the east, which is where Seattle is located. Prairies, shoreline, dense rainforests, mountain ranges, alpine lakes, and rivers with a lot of salmon are kind of the characteristics of this geography. Coast Salish communities, as well as a few non-Coast Salish tribes, have lived in this region for over 14,000 years, according to oral history. Tribal places that are imbued with origin stories still exist and are still talked about in daily life. And then, of course, there's archaeological evidence to support these claims as well. The Sklallam are related to many local tribes on the Olympic Peninsula, as well as across the strait into Canada. They're related by marriage, and they share linguistic and cultural customs. The tribe was known for their canoe and military power in battle, their ability to take over other tribal territory to gain new resources, as well as their generosity and hospitality to those from outside the tribe. These characteristics are really important to remember and consider as we discuss the modern tribal nation. Dozens of Sklallam villages with hundreds of culturally significant sites that span hundreds of miles are present within this geography. Most of these villages were anchored along waterways, such as the Strait of Juan de Fuca, as well as rivers or creeks on either side of the US-Canada border. Some villages were shared with members of other tribes, whereas other settlements were distinctly Sklallam. So we already see kind of this intercultural and cross-cultural theme happening during the pre-colonial period. To account for seasonal travel, hunting, and natural resource gathering patterns, winter and summer villages existed, with travel being performed in very large canoes that could hold, I think, up to 100 people. As well as extensive trail systems that spanned hundreds of miles into mountain ranges. And a lot of these trail systems today are highways and interstates and roads. As members of this Coast Salish umbrella, dozens of tribes that spoke 14 distinct languages and that lived primarily in Western Washington and Southern British Columbia, the S'Klallam were part of an extremely diverse as well as very dense population group, one of the densest, if not the densest, in North America. North of Coast Salish territory, into central and northern British Columbia, as well as Alaska, consists of Haida, Kwakwaka'wakw, Tlingit, Tsimshian groups, which you saw on that map. These are non-Coast Salish groups known for their elaborate totem poles, their intense theatrical performances, and their very strict societal division into various clans and kind of subgroups. Early anthropologists such as Franz Boas, as well as Edward Curtis, who is known for his photographs of that kind of late 1800 time period, they were especially known for their work with these northern groups, which really defined early American anthropology. However, Coast Salish society farther south, the group that we're talking about, was largely ignored by these scholars because they were not considered impressive enough by early anthropologists. Unlike the groups to the north, Coast Salish tribes, like the S'Klallam, were very private, they were very fluid, and they were very broad in their cultural composition. Coast Salish tribes aimed to encompass as much land, wealth, and resources as possible, which was attained by marrying into other tribes to kind of cement alliances and gain new land use rights. This led to a constant influx of new customs and a fluid sense of cultural belonging that's very different from what you see up north. Clans did not exist within Coast Salish society, with individuals instead identifying by their specific villages as well as their personal wealth or prestige. So there's a real emphasis on personal identity rather than communal identity. One's status was largely determined by an individual's interaction with what are called guardian spirits or spiritual forces, who endowed a person with certain knowledge about how to act, conduct affairs, or access resources. And these personal guardian spirits could come in the form of animals, plants, geographic features, weather patterns, all sorts of things. Revealing too much about your personal guardian spirit in public could hold you responsible for lessened status within your tribe, as well as potential harm. Unlike totem poles in the art scene in Northern societies that explicitly depict family crests or clan imagery that clans own, Coast Salish art alludes to, but never reveals one's guardian spirit. Coast Salish art, for lack of a better word, is simpler and more understated than that of Northern communities, due in large part to this Coast Salish tendency towards privacy and keeping one's spirituality very private and personal. The meaning of Coast Salish artistic motifs or designs were often only known by the owner or maker of an item, and there were very few public displays of art. Totem poles did not exist in this region, with most art instead used in individual religious ceremonies or displayed within the privacy of a longhouse, which you see in the photo here. In recent years, the JST has adopted totem poles to increase their tribe's visibility, despite that this art form seemingly clashes with their historical traditions. Doing so exemplifies how the tribe is maintaining a contemporary foothold within their homelands, adopting cultural customs emanating from other tribal nations, which is a pattern that they also did in the past, as well as using the monuments to perhaps protect more personal or meaningful S'Klallam motifs that are not shown to the public on totem poles. So all of these functions really mirror S'Klallam society of the past. Life began to drastically change in the 1770s when epidemics reached S'Klallam territory via northern and southern trade routes that began in California and the Southwest and also came down from Alaska into Washington. However, it wasn't until the 1780s to 90s that Spanish explorers reached the Olympic Peninsula. These men commented on the deserted S'Klallam village sites and hastily made graves, signaling that the European diseases had already taken a serious toll. Survivors interacted with explorers, but viewed these white men kind of as naive travelers who could be exploited for trade because the S'Klallam really had a monopoly on this large area. Because they maintain a monopoly over a vast territory, early European explorers did not pose much of an initial threat to the tribe. By 1819, Spain had relinquished its claims to the area by narrowly avoiding war with Britain, meaning that Sklallam homelands were now being visited by fur traders who were looking for primarily sea otter fur. The Sklallam economy was strengthened by an influx of wealth and new goods, and we began to see marriages between traders and Sklallam women increasing because female labor was needed for sewing clothes, making shoes, cooking, trapping small animals, and processing a lot of pelts. In return, women gained more access to trade networks and increased their socioeconomic standing, which benefited not only their marital union, between husband and wife, but also their tribal nation as well. In the 1850s, we witnessed a surge in Europeans who came to permanently settle Sklallam homelands. Unlike the explorers who kind of stayed close to the shorelines and waterways, these settler colonists were interested in logging the Olympic Peninsula's dense forests, damming its mighty rivers, grazing livestock on prairies, and making the landscape, quote unquote, more productive for the white towns that would soon be built directly on top of Sklallam village sites. Washington Territory was founded in 1853, with treaties signed with most of the state's major tribes in 1855, including Sklallam. Sklallam leaders were threatened to sign the Treaty of Point-No-Point, which ceded over 400,000 acres for white settlement in return for a tribal reservation, annual payments, goods, and medical or educational services. However, the tribe was told that they needed to relocate to a communal reservation where multiple tribes would live, located 70 miles south of their traditional lands in what was considered kind of enemy territory. Many Sklallam individuals refused to go, and in response, they were chained to canoes and towed via steamship down Puget Sound area to this reservation, where they escaped and walked back to their own villages, which were now located in what was legally non-native territory because of that treaty signing. Tribal individuals refused the treaty terms in response and would not receive the often rancid annuities that were provided to them by the federal government. In turn, the federal government declared that the Sklallam no longer existed because they had seemingly rejected this legal document, and also said that the tribe was no longer eligible for any benefits. So in short, the Sklallam were not viewed as Indian anymore and did not legally exist in the eyes of the federal government. Sklallam villages were burned down and towns adopted ordinances that banned them from entering city limits. They were detribalized, had few places to relocate to, so Sklallam communities began to purchase land in their former territory with money made from doing odd jobs. Natives could not own land at this time, but their new status as non-native, because they were detribalized, allowed for the tribe to buy property. So this is a really unique kind of history. One particular group bought back a plot of land located at a former village site where settlers had not yet claimed. This new place, was called Jamestown. It was named after James Balch, who was the Sklallam man who facilitated the purchase, and this happened in 1874. Those who lived there and their descendants are today known as the Jamestown Sklallam tribe. At Jamestown, tribal members were largely free from white surveillance and created kind of a native town where they could continue to fish, perform ceremonies, and speak Sklallam without fear or repercussions. This insular place allowed for the protection and perseverance of JST customs and showed how the tribe used settler colonial concepts of private land ownership, as well as their non-native status, to demonstrate tribal sovereignty and resilience during a time of extreme cultural stress. The tribe continues to demonstrate these values today by creating and displaying totem poles, which is another form of cultural adaptation that has proven extremely useful in communicating tribal identity on stolen land, as well as useful for preserving JST stories and knowledge. With all of Sklallam territory ceded during the treaty, settlers began to cultivate and transform the region by taming it. Wolves were nearly hunted to extinction, trees were chopped down at a very alarming rate, and the waterways were completely rerouted. These processes of development and control had to first be achieved before renaming and rededicating the landscape as a non-native one. Non-native settlements acquired regional personalities based on the settlers who arrived there and kind of claimed them as their new homelands. Towns like Port Angeles, which is on the western end of the Olympic Peninsula, were known and remain known for their conservative politics and reliance upon mills. Whereas Port Townsend, which is closer to Seattle on the eastern end of the peninsula, became transformed into kind of a rowdy port town with ambitions of becoming a city that would be as successful as Seattle. That never happened. Small towns were founded by Italian and Scandinavian settlers as well, who attempted to recreate their own homelands in this new landscape. So these particular settlements often bordered Jamestown, that tribal settlement, leading to frequent intermarriage and exchange between Norwegian, Swedish, and Sklallam communities. As their familiarity with each other grew, the tribe faced accusations that they were less native because of their Scandinavian partners. While settlers were taming the natural environment for easier control and conquest, federal officials were also redefining the idea of wilderness. So wilderness, which settlers had kind of worked tirelessly to eviscerate because it was a threatening concept, threatening to progress. This concept now proved kind of a means of attracting tourism and promoting wildlife conservation to the region, as well as an attempt to further erase Sklallam influence from the Olympic Peninsula, because there was this new focus solely on the region's natural as opposed to human or cultural history. President Theodore Roosevelt proposed Olympic National Park, which composed a majority of the now uninhabited Olympic Peninsula, because there were so many wilderness designations in place that you couldn't live in these places that were legally protected. Defining the landscape as a protected area stood in stark contrast to the ways in which the landscape had been and continues to be altered by loggers, miners, and farmers. Under the guise of a national park, the Olympic Peninsula was presented as an untouched no man's land, preserved kind of for the national good. Its identity as a site of ancient Sklallam history and recent contestation between settlers and indigenous individuals really went unnoticed in favor of attracting tourists to the new national park. Remaining local lands were then designated as national wildlife refuges and state parks, thus limiting Sklallam access to homelands and promoting an image of the region as really devoid of native presence. Many of these parks and sites were stealthily accessed by JST individuals who resisted the new designations and continued to hunt, gather, and camp in what were restricted areas. Marrying into white communities also allowed the JST to kind of regain control over their lands, or lands that were once theirs, with many mixed Sklallam families coming to own farms and dairies near significant tribal, religious, and cultural sites. With the Sklallam occupying homesteads and settlements removed from major white towns, settler colonists began to adopt a persona rooted in tropes of white nativism and kind of pretend indigeneity. This identity increased with Chinese immigration to the area. You see a lot of people of Chinese or Japanese descent coming to this region in the late 1800s to early 1900s for railroad and mill work. Threatened by what they perceived to be outsiders or non-European immigrants, white settlers went to great efforts to portray themselves as kind of the rightful native inhabitants of the Olympic Peninsula. Settler colonial nativist fraternities and clubs were founded in the region, where white men and sometimes women joined clubs such as the Improved Order of Red Men, Native Daughters of Washington, and the Pacific Indians. These groups hosted dinners and fundraisers, designated their own cemeteries for their own members, and took part in parades while clad in kind of pan-native regalia, such as headdresses and buckskin that you see in photos like this one. They also adopted new names and titles for their members that were used at meetings, such as Great Sachem, which is a Northeastern term. As the organization's title suggests, the improved order of red men positioned themselves as a better, more civilized version of indigeneity in which white men replaced local Native people. As symbols that reclaim the tribal territory surrounding the JST reservations, totem poles resist settler colonial depictions of indigeneity as extinct or floundering. In addition, the artistic nature of poles resists mainstream portrayals on the Olympic Peninsula as untouched by human hand. Instead, the JST monuments remind tourists and locals alike that the landscape is imbued with Native significance and interaction. Just as non-Native organizations, such as the Improved Order of Red Men, played Indian, as well as founded these monuments that you see on the screen here, kind of in pseudo honor of what was thought to be an extinct tribe. The JST then began raising totem poles as what I view as kind of counter monuments to their presumed erasure. So as counter monuments to presumed slalom disappearance, JST totem poles are unique in that they are not historically rooted within the tribe's artistic repertoire. Coast Salish artists were specialists in minimalism and abstract designs. Ovals, triangles, and crescent motifs formed repeating patterns that you see in Coast Salish art. Practitioners carved or painted large monuments in smaller numbers than Northern totem pole artists, but there was still a monumental culture that was happening in Coast Salish territory. This includes house posts, which you see here. These were large, kind of very sparsely decorated posts that were displayed within longhouses or sometimes at the entrance to a longhouse. They were similar to totem poles in their size, but alluded to personal rather than family history, origin stories, or kind of your clan's prestige. Welcome figures, which you also see here on the far right, were also present within slalom and Coast Salish society, and they were often seen at the entrance to Coast Salish villages. These tall figures often resembled humans or animals and were meant to welcome visitors to a village, but also to kind of intimidate and warn those with questionable intentions, because these are such imposing monuments. In contrast, totem poles and Northern art of Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian society is characterized by a very specific genre, which is called formline. Formline consists of an elaborate style governed by many unspoken rules that skilled artists spend lifetimes working to learn and perfect. These complicated designs portray interlocking figures, such as bears, humans, wolves, and birds, to create one kind of coherent, symmetrical image. Images are usually painted or carved in multiple colors, as opposed to Coast Salish preference for often no color at all. Whereas formline designs were meant to impress viewers as well as record historical events through a series of kind of convoluted imagery, Coast Salish art, which you see back here again, was deeply personal and did not explicitly depict images that others could, easily interpret. Anthropologists, fine art collectors, and museum curators of the early 1900s to mid 1900s were quick to label formline design and Northern totem poles as kind of the height of Native art, or the epitome of North American art, comparing these elaborate carvings to classical Greek and Roman sculptural traditions. Coast Salish art, in contrast, was derided for its simplicity and presumed lack of artistic contribution, with many scholars kind of positioning Coast Salish society as then more primitive or less sophisticated than the Northern formline communities because they held different and simpler art forms. As the tourist trade picked up, Coast Salish artists realized that formline designs were very sought after and highly valued. Coast Salish artists began to replicate these motifs, due in large part to a market that demanded formline. As a result, formline grew even more popular and was widely collected by museums. In the 1960s to 70s, non-native scholars canonized formline as kind of the preeminent art form of the Northwest Coast, rather than a very unique indigenous genre that only existed in the farther along the Northwest Coast. And you still see this today. I mean, a lot of people think of totem poles as kind of a Northwestern symbol, when in fact it's not necessarily. Books were written as guides for non-natives, how to make totem poles, how to create formline art. And classes were given at universities, such as the University of Washington in Seattle, where non-native students could learn how to create works like this, because the genre was viewed as an artistic genre that you could learn and replicate, rather than something that was distinct to a tribal community. This signaled non-native interest in native art, but it also suggested that cultural appropriation was taking place, and it generated a lot of competition amongst native and non-native artists for gallery and museum attention. In addition, Coast Salish artists continued to be, because their own artistic traditions were not very valued. And this led for personal creativity amongst artists themselves, or kind of the promotion of distinct tribal styles. Coast Salish artists eventually resisted many of these demands, which led to the Coast Salish artistic renaissance that took place in the 1970s to early 1980s, so very recently. Coast Salish art was kind of revived during this period, with a lot of these artists rejecting formline. Other attitudes towards art were also revitalized within Coast Salish communities, including creating art for ceremonial and personal use rather than museum exhibits. We see more Coast Salish art created for and circulated amongst tribes themselves at this time, and really removed from that commercial setting. When visiting the JST reservation, it is difficult to understand the complicated history of Coast Salish totem poles, as well as how Coast Salish art diverges from formline's kind of more flashy designs. Unsuspecting tourists to this region often assume that the colorful monuments represent, a historical or very deeply rooted Coast Salish custom that's been perfected by creating these poles for thousands of years. But in this setting, totem poles illustrate the extent to which the fine art market, as well as scholars, have really dictated and defined what qualifies as authentic or high quality Northwest Coast art. The Coast Salish artistic renaissance revived some distinct Coast Salish practices, communicating that formline's imposition was not always a welcome one. However, totem poles and formline continued to be produced by Coast Salish artists, such as the JST, signaling that the Northern art form still remains a very strong influence. To complicate the arrival of totem poles to S'Klallam territory, I also provide kind of alternate explanations for why the art form was adopted by Coast Salish artists. These explanations don't deny the role of kind of non-native pressure and demand, but they do emphasize Coast Salish agency and sovereignty in choosing to a new artistic style. Global tribal nation, the S'Klallam were in frequent contact and conflict with northern tribes such as the Haida and Tlingit. Both communities traveled up and down the coastline, which spans hundreds of miles, before and during the colonial period. These interactions undoubtedly included artistic exchange, which we really see in the 1800s when S'Klallam leaders began to wear tattoos that depicted Haida formline motifs. Historically at odds with each other, I speculate that early S'Klallam adoption of these formline designs acted as kind of a symbolic retaliation against the Haida, because Haida communities were often known to come into S'Klallam territory, come south, and take S'Klallam individuals as slaves, And so stealing Haida designs likely functioned in kind of a similar manner. These designs were the property, oftentimes, of specific Haida individuals or clans. And the Sklallam adoption of these motifs was not, taken lightly by Haida individuals. During the same time period of the late 1800s, totem poles began to represent kind of a pan-Northwest icon used by Northwestern cities, such as Seattle, as an urban icon or mascot. Poles were raised in a variety of non-Native settings, communicating that the art form was no longer restricted to just Native circles. Just as settlers had reimagined themselves as the new natives on the Olympic Peninsula, who kind of replaced Sklallam individuals, we see cities like Seattle also adopting an urban persona based upon pan-Indianism and Nativism. Later, Coast Salish artists were commissioned to carve poles in these urban settings, including the 1962 Seattle World's Fair that brought us the Space Needle. But many totem poles were also shown during that World's Fair and were carved by local tribes rather than more northern communities where totem poles had originated. As a regional icon, totem poles were adopted by some Coast Salish tribes, not really as an important tribal tradition, but instead more as a sign of their Northwest regional identity that they shared with non-natives. This pole carving craze made its way to the Jamestown tribe in the late 1960s, when the tribe's chairman, whose name was Brick Johnson at the time, he began carving totem poles and donating them to various local organizations, kind of as gifts from the tribe. Johnson held close ties with the carvers who created the poles for the Seattle World's Fair. So I don't think it's far-fetched to believe that by kind of their creations and their participation. However, because this was also the era, 1960s, 1970s, of the Coast Salish artistic renaissance, many young people within the Jamestown Sklallam tribe did not react favorably to this kind of idea of carving totem poles. And this practice was largely and very quickly abandoned by 1971. So it's a very short-lived tradition. However, 10 years later, in 1981, the JST attained federal recognition after years of petitioning for this status, because you'll remember that they had been detribalized since the 1850s. And up until 1981, they were not legally recognized as a legitimate Native nation. They were now legally recognized as a viable tribe after over 100 years of being detribalized and classified as non-Native. With more access to wealth, land, and government assistance with this new designation, the tribe began to open up restaurants, casinos, art galleries, hotels, shellfish operations throughout the Olympic Peninsula. They are now legitimate in the eyes of the federal government, though locals and tourists did not know much about the newly recognized tribe, because the region, like I said, was kind of plagued by ideas of wilderness and convenient native disappearance. Perhaps seeking to cement their status as a real Northwest Native nation, tribal leadership from the JST chose to embark upon a journey of creating dozens of totem poles for display on their new reservation. Non-Native artists who were trained in that form-line canon that was taught and kind of promoted in non-Native spaces in the 1960s and 70s, these men were hired by the tribe to create the monuments, which today number, I think, close to 60. Poles continue to be carved today by the tribe, representing a new tradition that has been connected to this community for about 30 years now. Because JST poles were introduced by tribal council and leadership, tribal chairman, many tribal citizens hold very different opinions on their community's kind of new monuments. This variety of perspectives might be construed as tribal conflict or controversy, but I think it also communicates that the tribe is not monolithic or one-dimensional, but that diverse perspectives are present within the tribe. And that really helps deconstruct notions of Native America as static, stagnant, or harmonious, which are tropes that we often see. Critiques emanating from inside the tribe include mixed emotions towards non-native carvers who are hired and employed by the community, as well as accusations of cultural appropriation. Some of these concerns are echoed by Tlingit and Haida formline artists farther north, who expressed disappointment that the tribe is using formline and totem poles rather than Coast-Salish designs that they view as kind of more appropriate in this setting. And they also expressed disappointment that the tribe hires non-Indigenous individuals to create these monuments. Others wonder why totem poles are necessary at all, and desire for the tribe to embrace Coast Salish art instead of totem poles. Many tribal citizens don't feel a connection to these monuments and state that the poles do not really represent their tribe's identity or history. So in this way, poles are positioned primarily as a tourist attraction or a form of kind of pan-native performance for a broad non-native audience. These critiques critics also believe that tribal leadership is actively participating in the erasure of its own history and it's kind of its own art, and are kind of misleading visitors who come to the reservation to admire the monuments, because you see the monuments, but there's often no context or signage given to situate these in a JST setting. So there is somewhat of a lack of transparency. Some express discontent that non-native carvers are not well versed in Sklallam history or culture because they're not a part of the tribe. And they wonder why JST artists, people who are native, are not hired instead. They believe that non-native artists have acquired kind of a fantasy or wannabe identity of indigeneity. So going back to that idea that we see in the 1800s of white nativist groups. And because the tribe, like I said, doesn't advertise that the poles are carved by non-natives, the role or ethnicity of these carvers are rarely questioned by the general public who really don't know any better. Young JST artists who are native state that they are hesitant to work with the non-native carvers employed by the tribe and feel unwelcome or devalued in kind of this non-native formline setting. Many female as well as gay JST artists agree, stating that the totem pole carving shed, which is located on the reservation, is kind of an arena replete with tropes of hypermasculinity, sexism, and homophobia, because the poles are all carved on non-native white men. Women in particular wonder why the tribe does not embrace other forms of art, such as weaving or more kind of women's arts, in comparison to these totem poles that they view as kind of a foreign imposition as well as a male imposition. In this way, we see different JST populations and subsets of the population wishing to redefine how the tribe represents its own cultural memory. Lastly, neighboring tribes who are familiar with the tribe's recent adoption of totem poles suggest that the JST has perhaps lost its identity or are less Sklallam because they are employing a new art form. They cite a lot of transparency concerns and believe that the practice is solely an economic one that attracts kind of tourist dollars to this thriving reservation. Many tribes on the Olympic Peninsula who surround the Jamestown Sklallam tribe are just, to put it bluntly, not as well off as this community. Their reservations oftentimes do not have casinos or large enterprise like the JST, and they're kind of plagued by high levels of poverty and unemployment, as well as substance abuse issues that I argue, because the JST is economically very well off, they don't affect the tribe in the same way. Upon closer examination, totem poles achieve more than meets the eye. Although surrounded by different and competing narratives, JST poles also promote Sklallam cultural heritage, resilience, and modern presence in a very unique way. Poles achieve a variety of accomplishments, which include, they demonstrate tribal sovereignty, success, and agency, because they are signs of the tribe's wealth and kind of economic standing on the Olympic Peninsula, where the tribe is, I think, the second largest employer of native and non-native populations. In the 40 years since they attained federal recognition, the tribe has managed to regain strength and are recognized as one of Washington's most kind of enterprise-driven and self-sufficient tribes. Lastly, employing non-native carvers signals that the tribe has an ability to commission work rather than perform it themselves. This mirrors historical circumstances amongst Coast Salish tribes and even northern tribes, where monumental art or hard labor was often hired out by tribal leaders, by people who are considered of lesser standing within the community. The tribe is extremely proud of their wealth and prestige, which I think the poles clearly communicate. Totem poles also redefine the local landscape as Indigenous in a way that resists wilderness depictions and in ways that are easily recognizable to non-natives who have really come to identify this icon with Native culture more broadly. In this way, poles draw attention to the tribe and detract from the region's natural beauty or some of the more problematic environmental tropes. Poles are extremely well built and durable to ensure that they will last decades. As a metaphor, as well as a vessel for JST presence, the totem poles do not demonstrate signs of age. They always look their best. Artists are always kind of touching them up or taking them down to refurbish them at the request of the tribe. So this really presents the idea of the JST as kind of timeless and existing in this region, since time immemorial. Poles also mark significant sites, such as former villages, burial grounds, or places associated with JST cosmology or origins. And so you see poles placed on or near these sites. Some poles also depict or refer to places with their imagery, which is often kind of only legible to tribal citizens or those familiar with JST history. Because poles are beautiful, but they're oftentimes difficult to kind of read or interpret if you're not familiar with the art form or with the context. Poles are present on the small JST reservation, as well as at the former JST settlement, which is located about 20 minutes away. And you also see them popping up in neighboring towns that were previously JST villages. So the entirety of the Olympic Peninsula is coming to be inundated with this art form. Perhaps most importantly, though, many JST poles depict slalom stories that have been passed down through oral tradition or recorded by early ethnographers. These story poles are important to the tribe because they not only record historical events and oral histories in a permanent manner, but because they provide visual proof of enduring JST culture, especially against accusations of tribal assimilation. In addition, no information is provided about the poles in the form of plaques or signage, which means that slalom history and oral traditions are protected, preserved from the eye of the general public, while simultaneously being displayed for the enjoyment of the general public. Other poles portray important tribal leaders and specific ancestors or individuals that contemporary tribal citizens trace their lineage to. And so this functions almost as like a physical family tree. Because poles are carved by non-natives with occasional help from native JST artists themselves, poles often encourage tourism and are donated as gifts to white majority towns on the Olympic Peninsula. They symbolize interethnic relationships as well as JST attempts to kind of reconcile their painful settler colonial past. Although the poles are often criticized for being too collaborative with local white communities, the monuments have led to better relationships between the two groups, with non-natives wishing to learn more about the tribe and kind of support JST sovereignty efforts. Sometimes poles elicit emotional responses on behalf of non-natives whose first introduction to JST trauma may come by looking at these monuments and encountering them. Although community members express a need for more contextualized information to accompany the poles, the tribe's totem poles kind of pique the public's interest in tribal culture and open the door for some more difficult conversations. During the course of my fieldwork, 3 new carvings were being created at the JST carving shed. However, to my surprise, these were not totem poles. Instead, they were totem pole-sized welcome figures, reminiscent of that older JST tradition where welcome figures were placed at the entrance to villages. The figures were being carved by tribal citizens on the reservation, rather than the non-native employees of the tribe. So it seems as though tribal leadership has perhaps acknowledged some of the criticism present within their own community and are indeed listening to younger generations who are calling for a return to more Coast Salish art forms as opposed to totem poles. And so this really signals, I believe, a turning point in JST art. These 3 welcome figures, one of which you see being carved on the bottom, will eventually be raised at Jamestown Beach, where the original JST settlement was once located. The tribe still owns property along the shoreline, but there are a couple non-native homes within that area now as well. It is interesting to consider that Jamestown Beach is not located near the JST reservation. It's about 20 minutes from there. And it's in a more remote area that you just wouldn't drive through if you didn't know it were there. It's rarely frequented by those who don't live in the neighborhood. The tribe hosts ceremonies at this beach, with some tribal citizens residing in homes along the road that were owned by their great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents. Although non-natives also live in homes here, Jamestown Beach is a quiet area that does not draw a lot of traffic or attention. Raising the welcome figures in this setting seems to signify that, unlike JST totem poles, these new monuments are not necessarily related to tourist consumption or identity performance, because there's just no one there besides the native community to see them. Instead, they will be present in a space largely frequented by tribal citizens during times of celebration, religious observance, or mourning, because Jamestown Beach is home to a tribal ceremony or cemetery, and annual ceremonies that are performed at the beach rather than on the reservation. So in conclusion, broadly speaking, my dissertation work enhances conversations related to identity performance and tourism, cultural change and invented traditions, and collective memory, and kind of how we understand and depict, I guess, our own memory. I examine tropes of Indigenous erasure, settler colonial amnesia, and perceptions of Native authenticity. Doing so reveals how tribal nations are working to creatively resist their presumed disappearance, while reconceptualizing themes such as wilderness and cultural heritage. As the JST's story suggests, one cannot examine any of these themes kind of in a bubble or by themselves. Instead, connections must be made across place and time, signaling that indigeneity cannot be confined to a single straightforward definition. I encourage new examinations of Native identity that include interaction, accommodation, and resistance as primary elements, rather than prescribed racial or ethnic categories that often arise out of settler colonialism. So thank you all for your, your presence and attendance. And now I think we can open it up for bigger discussion, hopefully.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. Let's all give Alexandra a Zoom round of applause.
Thank you.
Phenomenal.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop my